Claudian emperors in regard to foreign policy and the expansion of the Roman Empire. That's what we're going to have a very quick look at. Now, as ever, remember, warning, this is a revision clip, so it's very much a summary. There are, of course, additional sources and details that you could easily add to any answer on this question. We're also going to be making the assumption that a question is likely to focus on aggression or expansion. So we are assuming a fair bit here. In terms of a possible structure, you could easily answer this question in a much more thematic way, in a much more thematic approach, and that would work really, really well. But because this is revision, we're going to focus on a chronological approach to dealing with this question. So what would that look like? Well, first of all, we're going to have to deal with Augustus, and we're going to look at his aims of his foreign policy. We'd look at the differences between the West and the East of the Roman Empire and how Augustus deals with those areas. We'd also have to make a reference to our sources, so in particular Suetonius, our poetry, numismatic evidence, also res gestae. So that's going to be really important. For Tiberius, we're going to be questioning whether he continues Augustus's policies, but we'll have to start off looking at those army mutinies and in particular the role of Germanicus. And likewise, we're going to have to be looking at how Tiberius probably continues a fair few of Augustus's approaches to foreign policy via his use of provincial governors. We'll also have a very quick look at the Tacfarinas revolt in Africa using Tacitus. Gaius, is he an ineffective Roman emperor in regard to expansion of the empire? Claudius, the highlight is clearly going to be Britain, and we're going to have to discuss that in terms of expanding the empire. And for Nero, is he kind of uninterested? We need to make a reference to the use of his general Corbulo in Armenia and the revolts faced by Nero from his provincial governors that culminate in his suicide. So let's start off talking about Augustus. And Suetonius gives us a really cool little analogy, a memorable analogy that summarizes Augustus's approach to foreign policy. And that is fishing with a golden hook in verse 25. And really what this analogy is trying to show is that Augustus had a conservative and restrained attitude towards expansion, and that a campaign had to be carefully weighted and balanced between the costs of the campaign and the likely gains. Now, obviously, that's a huge contrast from Octavian and his early career in the late Republic, when he's anything but conservative and anything but restrained. But now, after the defeat of Antony and Cleopatra, when he is in sole control of the Roman Empire, Suetonius tells us that he's a lot more conservative. Now, Suetonius is writing a lot later on. He's director of the Imperial Archives, so he's pretty useful because he's got access to Augustus's papers. But the important thing is maybe there's a slight difference to the way that Suetonius is portraying Augustus and his foreign policy, and that difference between how he's viewing it and the actual information and evidence that we've got at the time, which maybe shows Augustus as being a little bit more aggressive than what Suetonius is actually making out. So we can see that with these coins. So these are two coins that commemorate the capture of Egypt, which is the top one with the rather cool Nile crocodile, and then you can see a Nike, daisy, down here, which is sort of striking the symbol of Armenia. So basically, these two coins are commemorating Augustus's conquests and capture of these areas. And that would have been really, really popular with a whole range of people across Roman society, from the people of Rome right up to Augustus's supporters in the Senate and obviously the army. And of course, army popularity is really important. So these coins being produced here clearly show that expansion and conquest are clearly important for Augustus's prestige. Now, by this point, Augustus had brought Rome's legions under his sole control. We'd seen the chaos of politicized militaries in the late Republic, and Augustus had made steps to ensure that Rome's legions were under his control. And we get these evidence in res gestae, or at least some of them referenced in res gestae. So legions reduced, pay standardized, the pension and land grants. Augustus in res gestae does emphasize how generous he is in this regard, but the result is that the army is exclusively loyal to him. So what about actual sort of campaigns? Well, there's For me, the difference between the West and the East, in the West, we've got a much more focus on aggression. In the East, much more diplomacy. And the reason for that diplomacy is that Parthian threat that exists. So what campaigns have we got in the West? Well, Res Gestae tells us that Augustus launches campaigns in the Alpine area, and it's Tiberius, Drusus, and Agrippa that take over these Alpine passes, which might be surprising to you that Rome still didn't control those areas. And we know that there's a new province set up, there's a new military base. So we've got some action in the northern part of Italy, or Cisalpine Gaul at this point. We've also got campaigns in Gaul and Spain. So these areas are not fully Romanized or controlled at this point, only recent conquests in regard to Gaul from Caesar's campaigns. So Augustus has to sort of go on campaign in these areas as well. Some great information again from Suetonius, little reference to Res Gestae from when he comes back, because when he comes back and peace has been established throughout the empire, the Senate commissioned the Arapakis for him in 13 BC. So again, we've got some action here. And then we've also got the two other big pushes towards the Danube into Pannonia over here, which is partly successful. Then there's a huge revolt, which is referenced by Res Gestae, and Tiberius is diverted down to deal with this. By this point, Agrippa's dead, and it's Tiberius that's doing all the fighting for Augustus. And then the very, very famous example is the attempt to push from the Rhine to the Elbe and to really boost Rome's frontiers to natural boundaries. The reason why the campaign in Germany is important is because it results in the disaster of the Teutoburg forest. So as Tiberius is diverted to deal with the Great Revolt in Pannonia, command in Germany passes to Quintilius Varus with devastating results. And Suetonius tells us that when Augustus finds out that his 3 legions have been massacred, he slams his head against the door and shouts out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions," and grows his hair and his beard and all sorts of stuff. So basically, these revolts did perhaps highlight that had Augustus reduced the legions to rather dangerously low levels. In the east, in particular in Armenia and Judea, we've got a much less aggressive attitude. And that's probably as a result of the Parthians that had massacred Roman legions in pretty recent memory. Remember, Crassus and Antony get battered by the Parthians. So previous Roman history sort of negates going to attack the Parthians, which is why Armenia isn't so important as a buffer state. There's a peace treaty that's negotiated by Tiberius, and that's really quite cool because you can link that peace treaty with the very famous Prima Porta statue and the breastplate, which shows Tiberius and the Parthian giving Tiberius back the eagles captured from Crassus. We've also got use of client kings in this buffer zone area, and there's lots of advantages of using client kings and their local knowledge rather than having a governor and troops on the ground. Armenia, it's Tigranes that Tiberius puts on the throne, and then Gaius Caesar later on has to sort of reconfirm a new king of Armenia. So lots of references there to client kings in Res Gestae and Augustus's use of client kings. In Judea, you've got the very interesting historical character of Herod. And for other expeditions, you've also got Augustus making reference to campaigns down in Ethiopia in Res Gestae as well. Verse 26 is really important for that. And basically, you can get a big chunk of reading from Res Gestae, verse 26 to 33. It shows you that this big chunk of Res Gestae being dedicated to foreign policy and success shows you how important military prestige still was for Augustus and for the way that he wanted to be remembered. So it's really interesting because I think that Res Gestae is a little bit of a contrast to how Suetonius depicts Augustus's attitude towards foreign policy. Suetonius gives us these two quotes from verses 21 and 22. universal peace by both sea and land, fame for justice and moderation. And you can easily link this whole attitude of Pax Romana with your poets. So there's lots of references to peace being established in this golden age in the poetry of Virgil, of Horace, and of Ovid. So it's pretty easy to do that and to see how Suetonius and the poets can be linked together. Let's look at Tiberius. Does he continue Augustus's foreign policy? Well, I think, yeah, kind of. However, he does have to contend with the army mutinies at the start of his reign in Pannonia and in Germania as well, which shows you that maybe Augustus's army reforms, which are referred to him as gestae, were not as successful as he would like us to believe. We've got two revolts led by legionaries who are really unhappy about the length of service, low pay, the demands that they get, and the general army discipline that they have to face. Tacitus is going to give us a big chunk of information on this, and he's really critical that Tiberius didn't go and that he sends his son and his adopted son. So Drusus and Germanicus are sent to go and deal with these. But maybe this is an example of some anti-Tiberius bias in Tacitus, because actually I think it's a pretty shrewd decision for Tiberius not to go and deal with the mutinies and to send, as Tacitus tells us, two half-grown boys to go and deal with this. Tiberius sends Germanicus to Germany, and his son Drusus is sent to Pannonia. So what happens in terms of Pannonia? What are the demands? Well, the demands are this: 4 sesterces a day, 16-year term, cash on retirement. And Drusus really sort of reads a letter from the Senate, and he's much, much more Tiberian in his treatment of the mutineers. So there's an eclipse of the moon. He spins that spectacularly well, and the leaders are executed, and the mutinies done and dusted. Tacitus, though, says that Germanicus, well, he's really praising Germanicus's actions, but I think you can actually see Germanicus is actually a lot less effective than Drusus is. So in Germany, they want to end this crushing service. They want the legacies left by Augustus paying, and we've got this rather sort of showy spectacle that Germanicus delivers, where he threatens to kill himself. He's already taken his family in with him, so Agrippina and their kids as well. Is I think pretty poor leadership, and Tiberius not happy, promised payments and accelerated discharges. Tiberius is not going to be happy with that, but Tacitus praises Germanicus. So the important thing is, how does Tacitus treat Germanicus' actions? He's really praising them. However, is that just because he's trying to build Germanicus up before he then obviously inevitably bumps him off via Piso in Syria? And certainly Tiberius not happy with Germanicus and how he deals with it, brings him back to Rome, sends him off to the east, and then that's not going to work out well for Germanicus. So let's have a look at these 4 key areas in the empire that Tiberius has to deal with, which would be the Rhine, the Danube, East, and Africa. So in a nutshell, how can we summarize Tiberius's attitude towards expansion and foreign policy in these areas? All the information from Tacitus. With the Rhine, very much a hands-off attitude. So basically, he doesn't want to annex Germania. He leaves them to their own devices. There is that rather touching little bit where the legions find the remains of their soldiers at Teutoburg Forest and then sort of intern them properly. The Danube is much more efficient. So we've got one governor in that entire province for 20 years, and it's combined into one province. Our writers sort of say that this is evidence of Tiberius not really caring, but actually, rather than replacing governors every year or two, is this actually a symbol, a sign rather of Tiberius keeping an efficient governor in place. In the east, again, very similar to Augustus, it's all diplomacy, no direct military action. Tinsy-wincy bit of annexation in southern Turkey with Cappadocia, but again, on the whole, it's pretty much diplomatic. And in Africa, you've got the Tacfarinas revolt, where the Senate get asked to send a commander. They can't make their flipping minds up, and then they end up sending Sejanus' uncle to go and deal with it, or rather, Tiberius does. So, in a nutshell, this is kind of continuing-ish Augustus's attitude towards foreign policy. Gaius. So is he uninterested, or is he too bothered conquering the sea? Well, the coin that I'm about to show you is really sort of reiterating that Gaius is basing a lot of his prestige on his dad. So his dad, remember, is Germanicus, and here he is with Gaius as well. And this is pretty much telling us that um, Germanicus's popularity was really important for Gaius's authority. So again, having a military figure in your family tree or as your dad is really, really useful. There's three key areas really for that Gaius sort of deals with. Our sources are pretty skimpy in terms of detail because they're obviously focusing on Tiberius's madness. So in Germany and Britain, he announces the annexation but doesn't actually occupy it. In Africa, he takes Mauritania. And the East, again, he's quite happy to take areas and then give them to particular favourites, whether that's Antiochus III or Commagene, or whether it's Herod Agrippa as well. So there's a slight major hiccup with the removal of the king of Armenia, which allows Parthia to regain influence there. So on the whole, there's not too much info. Big chunk from Suetonius. Josephus and Dio are also not really massively complimentary about Gaius. Claudius. The big thing that's always associated with Claudius is the conquest of Britain. The important thing when considering this is, why is there a need for military success and for military aggression? And is it because of the manner of Claudius's accession and the way that he got the support of the Praetorian Guards, obviously commemorated on one of the exam spec coins? But also maybe because of a lack of support in the Senate. Do remember, after Gaius' assassination, Josephus tells us that there is a definite move to restore the Republic, but the people and the army are against that. So Claudius, maybe for his own popularity's sake, needs some type of military success. Again, we can see the importance of having a militarily cool dad. In our first coin, here's Drusus, which is Tiberius's brother, and Claudius's dad, that's being commemorated here, and in particular his campaigns in Germany as well. Do remember Germanicus was Claudius's brother. So again, emphasizing how important it is that you've got military achievements in the family. So this is celebrating those successes. And equally, here's the coin that celebrates Claudius's conquest of Britain. So there's Claudius over here, and we've got our little triumphal arch, which celebrates Claudius's conquest over Britain. So clearly, it's still really important. Hence why this coin is being produced anyway. Look at how many times he's hailed as imperator as well. On the whole, can we sort of say that Claudius is actually quite similar to a previous Roman figure, but maybe not quite Augustus, Tiberius, or Gaius? I think if we're looking at Claudius's attitude towards expansion and towards the areas that he conquers, he's actually way more similar to Caesar, maybe. Really, in terms of expansion and assimilation, encouraging Romanization, you get that particularly from the debate in the Senate, where he's trying to expand the Senate using Gauls and the senatorial opposition, the establishment of colonies. I think there's a definite link to sort of Caesar's general attitude. Suetonius, verse 17, is not very impressed at all with Claudius's campaign. It's a very cursory mention. Says that he's not there for long. It's actually pretty. Suetonius is just not impressed with Claudius's conquest of Britain. But is that because he's writing from a senatorial point of view, and again is sort of, you know, not a huge fan of Claudius because of the way he became emperor and the way he was influenced by his wives and his freedmen? It's also pretty interesting to link this to Caractacus and the coverage of Caractacus in Tacitus as well. So there's some interesting links there that you can make with Suetonius and Tacitus in regard to the conquest of Britain, and then how that revolt is launched and then dealt with by Claudius and his associates. So finally, Nero. Again, our source is trying to show that he's not really that interested. He's actually very fortunate because he has a supposedly very able general, Corbulo. And in particular, Corbulo sort of deals with the problems that had been kind of left over in the East, and in particular in Armenia. Here's a coin that is talking, or discussing rather, about Corbulo's victories in the East, which is being celebrated by Nero. So we've got the triumphal arch, we've got Mars with his spear over here, peace being established, there's victory over there, and it's pretty much sort of celebrating the victories of Corbulo between 58 and 62. So again, the idea that conquest, expansion, and authority and the emperor's influence is still really, 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 really important. Despite this, and this is evidence on the ground, Suetonius actually says, well, Nero's not bothered about it in verse 18, which is an interesting contrast from the coin. So a little bit of a difference there. Of course, for Nero, also be aware that the relationship with Corbulo is not particularly fab. Corbulo eventually, despite being this hugely successful general, it's massively praised, particularly by Tacitus as well. Nero's so concerned about his popularity, he orders him to commit suicide. Dio also links or corroborates rather what Tacitus says in regard to Corbulo, his victories, and then his inevitable suicide. So he's seen as a contrast to Nero. Beware, of course, there's two big revolts that either happen or start in Nero's reign. The Boudica revolt, as a result of, well, accumulated grievances, in particular, with the will not being recognized, and then the harsh treatment of Boudica and her daughters. So that's pretty brutal. And the Jewish revolt as well actually does start under Nero's reign as well. So not massively successful is Nero. And finally, we can discuss with Nero that the issue of the revolts that occur at the end of his reign as well. So Vindex and Galba. Nero is not shown to be particularly competent at all in regard to dealing with these revolts. So ignoring orders, legs it back to Rome. He considers slaughtering all governors, poisoning the Senate, setting fire to the city, and then starts ordering the craziest army you've ever heard of, which means that he loses support of the people. So if you've not read it, or you only read it once, it's well worth reading again just for sheer giggles. Verse 44 and verse 45, where he gets all these prostitutes ready to fight as his Amazons, and there's some crazy material in that verse. It's actually hilarious, but the result is that the people universally loathe him, and then Nero knows he's actually totally stuffed as well. The statues collapse, he has terrible dreams, and Nero knows that he's stuffed. So in conclusion, Augustus, you could say, has a very careful balance between aggression and diplomacy. Tiberius, a certain degree of continuation, but then equally we do have the issue with Germanicus. Gaius, pretty ineffective. Claudius, Britain, but is that a result of his problems with the Senate? And Nero, again, is he maybe sort of uninterested? And then when he actually has a successful general, does he actually see Corbulo as a threat to him?